Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Colonel Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of when did England become a nation? Now that might seem like a very strange question, but we're going to kind of go through it now. So what really influenced me into making this video is because there's a YouTuber who I watch, a really great channel. I don't mean any disrespect with this, I highly recommend you check them out, and they're called Cynicalhistorian. Now, one of the videos that he made was called Nationalism Began in the 19th Century, and he also did another video which is called Nations Are New, or something to that effect. And basically the thesis that he's kind of making was that actually, nationalism, is a 19th century invention. And for many places that holds true, right? If you look at America, the first time that America kind of gets referred to as the United States as opposed to these United States was during the Civil War. And so, the idea of the American nation kind of came as a result of the American Civil War. Similarly as well, if you look at German national identity, as we've discussed before, Germany didn't really become a nation until after the unification in 1871. Same thing with Italy after 1861, and France, even at the time of the French Revolution, only 20% of French people could actually speak French, because you had all these other dialects and regional languages and stuff, etc., etc. So it wasn't until the late 19th century when you had compulsory education in France, where they literally would beat kids, and chastise kids for speaking their regional languages and dialects in the school playground. So in those cases there, the national identity had to be superimposed on them and stuff, right? Also as well, if you look at Poland, if you look at Hungary, you look at all these other kind of places, right? The idea of the common people kind of identifying with the sense of nationhood, with the sense of we are this, we're not that, etc., etc. That's again a 19th century invention. However, there's flaws in that argument, right? And there's exceptions to that, as with everything, right? And I would say, not just because I'm an English nationalist, but I would say that England kind of disproves that. Now, I wouldn't say that England's the only place that disproves that, because I think if you look at many of the Scandinavian countries, if you look at Sweden, you look at Denmark, you look at Norway, again, it's quite difficult to make the argument that these are 19th century inventions, because in many regards, you can see a unified kind of thing going all the way back to the High Middle Ages, right? Obviously, there's a little bit of overlap at some points, etc., etc. But I think, broadly speaking, you can kind of make the argument for them as well. And you could make a similar argument with regard to Scotland as well, right? So this kind of sense of a nation. First of all, we have to define what a nation actually is, right? So nation, the root of it comes from the Latin natio, and this basically means birth or birthplace. And we're going to go with the Oxford Dictionary definition here, right? Which is this: a country considered as a group of people with the same language, culture, and history who live in a particular area under one government. Now, obviously, this is quite a broad kind of that definition, especially if you think nowadays in kind of a globalized world. If you think about England at the moment, for instance, France at the moment, obviously has many different cultures, has many different peoples, immigrant people and stuff, and their descendants. So it's quite difficult to say that, but they're the same people with the same culture and the same history. So maybe one could argue that today there kind of are no nations then, if you want to kind of get technical. But I think, just for simplicity's sake here, this kind of, instead of looking perhaps at the present, let's kind of go back a little bit in the past, just to kind of make a bit more sense of it. So basically, with all this, what I can kind of say is the cynical historian, he even says it at a certain point in his video. The reason why he's basically saying this thing of nationalism is a 19th century invention, it's a new thing. The reason he's kind of saying that is because he even says that he's a cosmopolitan, that he believes, doesn't believe in nationalism, right? And so I felt that the way that he kind of dealt with it kind of just discredited the idea of nationalism, and it was purposely, so if your starting thesis is nationalism is bad, then you try and basically dismiss it by being oh, it's only a 19th century invention anyway. Anytime he kind of would loosely try and mention England, for instance, he started by basically some people kind of say that history goes way back, but that's just chauvinistic nonsense, whatever. And he's that's not really dissecting the actual argument. That's kind of just more, everyone's entitled to their own opinions and stuff, but that's kind of I watched the video twice, and then I watched it another time just before doing this, and I still couldn't make any sense of it, because it kind of was coming from that perspective, right? But what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of dive into this a little bit more, and we're gonna unpick this, and we're going to do this by looking at the history of England. So hope that you join me with this journey. And the bonus question for this video is, at what point do you think that England became a nation? And actually, I have a book here, which I was reading. I've mentioned this in like the previous video, and it's The Shortest History of England by James Hawes. And basically, the other week, I started reading this book, and I marked off the point at which I thought that England became a nation, right? And we'll get onto that a little bit later. But yeah, so that's kind of, is a really good book. There's other books, of course, obviously. But yeah, so let me know what you think. But for now, we're going to dive into the video. So starting off with the history of England, right? We can't really start it, 2,000 years ago, right? Because there was no sense of England. Like, no, that's just completely wrong. So first of all, we have to obviously factor in the fact of the Celts are not like the native people of these islands. There were people who were before there, but that's a whole different story for another day. But anyway, the Romans invaded in 43 AD, and they stayed until 410 AD. And after that time, and kind of like during that time, when the Romans were pulling out, you end up having mass migration of Germanic people across the seas, right? So there were German invasions like kind of all around like Europe, as we've kind of discussed in our video on like the Frankish Empire. Definitely check that video, it's really, really good. But with regard to that, England is kind of an exception, because whereas in all these other places, they just, like, it was just the men going about conquering, and they just become infused with like the local populations. England, because by sea you can obviously transport many more people, so they brought like their wives and children with them as well. So obviously people like intermixed and stuff, etc., etc. But there's quite a large kind of influx of people from like kind of like what's today like the northern coast of like basically Holland and like Germany and stuff. So basically this is where the kind of Anglo-Saxons came from. So Anglo-Saxons came there and basically replaced the kind of like culture and the language and stuff of the Romano-Britons who were living there. And over time, they end up consolidating after fighting a lot with like different kingdoms and stuff, right? And then eventually in 927 AD became England, right? Well, not really. So the first time that England becomes a unified state is under Ethelred the Great, and that's in the year 927. However, you can't really describe it really as a nation. Also as well, because you have like the Vikings there as well, so you have like the Danelaw, so like many places along the kind of eastern coast of England, very much heavily influenced by the Danes, and many of the Danes have come to settle. So you can kind of say it's the same history and the same culture and stuff, but it's not really. Like, even if we look at like Beowulf, which is like kind of a classic kind of like Anglo-Saxon like story, a lot of it is actually like, when you look into it, is actually trying to like bring the Danes into this kind of narrative as well. So fast forward now to 1066, and you're having the Norman invasion, right? So this is William the Conqueror. He ends up taking over England and basically brings over his own like kind of like knights, and like sets up an aristocracy there. And this aristocracy rules England for literally centuries, right? Now, a lot of people might not be fully aware of this, but the kings of England and like the aristocracy of England, for the next 200 to 300 years, spoke Norman French, right? They didn't speak English, right? And I'm saying Norman French because obviously, as we said before, it wasn't like French as we'd understand today. It was like the regional dialect of Norman French, right? So this was kind of superimposed on the country, right? So if you wanted to become part of the elite, if you wanted to move in those elite circles, you wanted to basically move up like from the ranks of the commoners, you had to learn Norman French, and you had to speak Norman French, right? And people who only could speak English, or probably better yet to say Anglish, yeah, because it's not like English as we kind of like recognize today. It's like Old English, and we'll get into that a bit later, but it's quite unrecognizable, right? But if you could only speak like kind of English, right, you couldn't really progress within the society then. So this is kind of a top-down kind of imposition of a foreign culture onto England, right? So we can't really say that England began in 1066 because it's been conquered, right? So fast forward now almost 150 years or so, and you end up having in 1204, you have King John, and this is the first time, because he loses the Duchy of Normandy, it's the first time when the King of England is not also the Duke of Normandy. So this kind of marks out a thing where it's like, okay, so now like the king and the elite who are underneath him, right? These people are English, but it's kind of just by accident, right? They're just geographically they're English, right? But like I said, they still keep speaking Norman French. They don't speak English, right? And even when we think about a document like Magna Carta, yeah, so we always kind of say that Magna Carta is kind of this great moment in kind of like English like history and stuff, and it kind of lays the groundwork for our constitution, etc., etc. We discussed that last video. Definitely check that out. But at the same time, you have to also recognize that while it did infer a lot of the kind of like rights onto like ordinary people, primarily it was done for, by, and of the barons, right? Kind of like, so the lords who were basically rebelling against the king, they wanted more political rights, and they wanted more like influence and stuff, and more control over like the public purse. So that's kind of what Magna Carta is primarily all about. And also, this is something to note, that so Magna Carta was signed in 1215. It wasn't translated into English until 1534. Now, what's significant about 1534 is that also that's the year of the break from Rome. This is when Henry VIII, during the Protestant Reformation, this is when like there's the separation from Rome, and basically saying that England is its own entity and is separate from like foreign influence and foreign domination and stuff, right? That's why Henry VIII had it translated into English, but you're talking about a period over 300 years after the actual signing of it, right? So we can't really say, well, some people might be able to argue, right? But you can't really say that England began as a nation in 1215. And you can't really say it for 1258 either, right? So during this time, you had Simone De Montfort, very English sounding name, right? So basically what he was trying to do is there was basically a rebellion again, like with like the barons, and what they're trying to do again is trying to have more kind of constitutional reforms and financial reforms, basically put more power into like the hands of the aristocracy as opposed to just the monarch. So during this time, this is when he forces Henry III to sign the so-called Provisions of Oxford. So this basically, like I said, trying to tie in the power of the king. But what's notable about this is, for the first time, someone from the English aristocracy is speaking to the common people, because he's trying to like rally them, trying to rally them to his cause. And he's speaking to them, well, first of all, he speaks to them in like Norman French, but he also speaks to them in English. So this represents the first time, you're talking almost 200 years after the Norman conquest, and this is the first time that a member of the aristocracy is actually trying to communicate to the people of England, in English, right? So this gives you an idea of the extent of like just how like colonized we were, basically, right? And you also can't say it with regard to when they set up like the first parliament either, because again, this was a thing where it's set up, right? But again, it was just for the barons, and what was spoken in that parliament was Norman French. So you can't really say it's in 1295 either. So what I'm saying basically with regard to all this is, I think that England became a nation some point within the 100 Years' War, right? So the 100 Years' War, confusingly named because it lasts for 116 years, and it goes from 1337 to 1453. So that's a long period, but within that war, which is kind of more a series of different wars, right, you see a transformation of England and its aristocracy and its monarch, right? So at the beginning of the war, right, you have the English, like kind of like so-called foot folk, so these like the foot soldiers and stuff, and they're going about and like they're fighting in France, right, for like the monarch and like for the aristocracy, and they kind of notice, they're like, hold on, how comes we're fighting in France against Frenchmen, but we have an aristocracy and a king who's speaking a dialect or a language of French? This doesn't really make too much sense. You're like kind of like, so what the kind of aristocracy who served out there kind of began to realize is that in order to rally their troops more, they had to speak to them in English, right? And this is when you start to see a kind of a bit of a transformation, within the nobility, where they become to kind of recognize themselves more as English, and they use English in like their common tongue, right? So this kind of represents the beginning of that process, right? But I think the real change really kicks in with regard to the Black Death and what ends up coming afterwards, right? So the Black Death, obviously, is from like 1347 to 1348 in England, and this, combined with all the other kind of like plagues that kind of like came in like the next few years afterwards, end up wiping out half of England's population. So as we've said in other videos, right, whenever you have less of something, it becomes more valuable, right? So when you have less labor, this means that the price of labor increases, i.e. wages increase. And because there's so much like vacant land that was kind of like about in the place, because obviously the Black Death touched everyone from like, you know, nobility down to like the peasantry, right? So a lot of people end up having newly acquired wealth, right, which is completely independent of the aristocracy. So you start to have the creation of a kind of rural middle class for the first time. And these people were very much demanding more political rights, more kind of like civil rights and stuff, right? And what this ended up causing is the Statute of Pleading in 1362. So this, for the first time, right, English in English courts was allowed to be spoken, right, and actually recognised as an official language. So don't get me wrong, most of the proceedings were still done in Norman French. So bearing in mind this is almost 300 years after William the Conqueror had like taken over England. So almost 300 years of occupation. Finally, English is allowed to be spoken in English courts, right? So maybe here you could make a bit of an argument that maybe England becomes a nation state at this point. But it's quite hard to kind of say that. I don't really think you can kind of like say that. But a lot of other things were happening this time as well. Like, so culturally, England was kind of transforming itself, right? Right, so in 1380, you end up having William Langland, and he ended up writing the Piers Plowman, and this is the first reference that we have of Robin Hood, right? So Robin Hood and his merry men, they're fighting in so-called Merry England, right? And what they're basically doing is, you know, they're rebelling against the aristocracy that are there. It's the ordinary English folk, and their tales of heroism and stuff, and like kind of triumphing over like kind of like their social betters. This kind of begins to really tie into the kind of like the kind of national spirit, yeah, which was kind of being reawoken within the ordinary English people. And also during this time as well, you had the Lollard Movement. So as we kind of have mentioned in our other video on the English Reformation, definitely check that out. You know, so within that, you end up having people basically demanding that the Bible, which up until that point was just in Latin, right? You know, they demanded that the Bible be translated into English, right? And that there ought to be a nationalized English church, and that England should not be kind of like governed by kind of like foreign influence and stuff, yeah, such as like, well, the influence from Rome. So in many ways, these are kind of proto-Protestants, right? This is Protestantism before the Reformation, right? So in many ways, like kind of like this kind of leaves a bit of a groundwork, yeah, for like how England was always a bit more rebellious than many other places on the continent. Not all, but more rebellious than many other places, right? And this Lollard movement was really preeminent in like the 1380s and like the 1390s. And also what happened during this period as well was something called the Peasants Revolt. Now, the Peasant Revolt happened in the richest part of England, right? This is in the southeast, near London. And many of the peasants here were what we said before, they kind of like, you know, this rural, middle class and working class, right? So not necessarily the poorest kind of people within the kingdom, right? But they're ordinary people and they're demanding political rights, right? So what they demand is, as we said before, in terms of, you know, they want the Bible to be written in English, they want a nationalized English church, and they basically want more kind of like political rights and stuff. So for them, when they're talking about like, you know, they want rights for the people here in England, right? And obviously, as you can see on screen there, it's not spelt exactly how like we would kind of say England, but it kind of gives you an idea of these people recognize themselves as English, right? It's not something which is being superimposed on them. In fact, it's the very opposite. They're having to kind of like establish themselves and trying to like force like kind of English, like kind of like from the bottom up. And during the Peasant Revolt, which was led by Wat Tyler, you know, he ends up like, you know, greeting the king on horseback, which obviously you're not supposed to do if you're just an ordinary peasant. And as far as I'm aware with regard to the story, it's something like he goes over to the king and like grabs him by the arm and calls him brother, at which point I believe like the Lord Mayor of London comes and like strikes him down. So in order to try and like calm the peasantry down, what King Richard II does is he goes to the people, and for the first time since before the Norman conquest, an English king speaks to his own people in their own language, right? So he speaks to them in English. And this kind of calms the people down, like, you know, so kind of so the rebellion kind of like peters out and stuff, right? However, fast forward a few years now, it's 1399, and King Richard II is overthrown, and the next king, who is Henry IV, he ends up being crowned. And this coronation here marks the first time since before the Norman conquest when a coronation takes place in English. So we have a situation here where for the first time we have an English king, right? And so this kind of marks like a radical shift, right? And you can see, so like we said, from the bottom up, Englishness as a national identity is kind of being forward, right? So as we've said with the definition, right, this is the first time when you have a unified language, because during this time you also, a little bit afterwards, you had the so-called Great Vowel Shift. So this took place between roughly 1400 and 1550. Well, first of all, we end up having this kind of merger between Norman French and this kind of English, or kind of Old English. And so this is when you start to have this fusion, which creates modern English, as we could say today. Or there's debates about whether this is, you could say this is Middle English, I believe, that's the kind of term for it and stuff. But still, this is, quite radically different, from what was beforehand. So if you look at texts from the 1300s, right, the early 1300s, it's quite difficult for us as modern English speakers to kind of make sense of it. We can kind of get the gist of it, but it's quite difficult. However, when we look at stuff from the 1400s, now we can kind of start to read it and go, oh, actually, this is something which I actually recognize as English rather than just being another kind of Germanic language. And so now you end up having this kingdom, and it has a unified language, a unified culture, unified history, and it's under one government. So by all definitions, I think that roughly around this time, like I said, there's not a specific date and stuff, right? But roughly around this time, I think it's quite clear to say that England is a nation. Now, obviously, it's not a hard and fast rule. Obviously, people can have their own opinions in the comment section. So like I said, please let me know in the comment section. But, some people might say, England became a nation in 927. Some people might say it's in 1066. Some people might say it's in 1215. Some people might say it's 1381. Some people might say it's 1399. And some people might say that it's not until Henry VIII breaks from Rome in 1534 that England becomes a nation. But I think it's quite difficult to read the works of John Donne and the works of William Shakespeare and all these other people, who were talking about England in that time, right? And it's quite difficult to hear them talk about England as a nation in a way that we would kind of understand it, and basically to come to the conclusion that England, like all the other nations, is a 19th century creation. In many ways, cynical historian, no disrespect to you at all, much love. But I think that in many ways, your take is a very Eurocentric one. And what I mean by that is a Eurocentric in terms of on the continent. Your thesis makes sense on the continent, but when you're talking about Scandinavia and when you talk about the British Isles, it doesn't really hold that much water yet. And so England hopefully kind of stands as an example of that. And but anyway, let me know what you think in the comment section. And if you like that video, don't forget obviously to hit the like button, sharing as well, sharing is caring, as we always say, and subscribe if you haven't. If you're one of the people who watches my videos every single week and you haven't subscribed yet, I don't know what you're doing, go and subscribe, log in, subscribe, okay? It helps me out a lot, and it really helps the channel to grow and stuff. We've got a whole lot more kind of planned and stuff in the future. The next video, I've been wanting to do this for a while, right? So I want to combine my love of four-way chess, right, which we'll explain more in the next video, right, combined with geopolitics. So we're going to look at the current crisis in Ukraine, and we're going to look at the kind of competition between China and America and stuff, etc., etc. So within all of that, we're going to take a kind of more step back look at how geopolitics actually operates in the world. So definitely stay tuned for that video. But in the meantime, have a great day and bye.